Sarah and Brian had been married for 13 years and shared a life with their two children, 8-year-old Ava and 6-year-old Logan. On the surface, everything seemed fine. They lived in a tidy two-story home just outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Their lives followed a comfortable routine. Sarah handled the morning school drop-offs before heading to her job at an insurance firm, while Brian, a freelance graphic designer, worked from home and took care of after-school pickups. Life was busy but stable. One evening, Sarah walked into the living room, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Brian, you have to come," she insisted after putting the kids to bed. "They're throwing a party for me. Well, for my whole team, actually. It's mostly to celebrate my promotion. I want you there." Brian lowered the TV volume. "A corporate party? You know that's not really my scene," he replied. He was more of a homebody, but he knew how much her promotion to senior account manager meant to her. Over the past few months, he had watched her come home late, exhausted yet fulfilled. Sliding next to him on the couch, Sarah pleaded, "Please. It's a big night. I want everyone to meet my husband. They always ask about you." He exhaled slowly. "Fine, I'll go. But promise me it won't be all business talk and endless small talk about spreadsheets." She laughed, her relief evident. "I promise. We'll have a great time." A week later, on a crisp Friday evening in December, they arrived at the Meridian, a swanky downtown venue rented for the celebration. Outside, the temperature hovered around 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and a gusty wind nipped at their coats. Twinkling lights adorned the grand entrance, leading them toward the warmth inside. "Wow, they really went all out," Brian remarked, eyeing a flashy banner overhead. Sarah smiled nervously and squeezed his hand. "We've been hitting record numbers. Management is thrilled." Inside, a hostess offered champagne flutes, which Sarah accepted, handing one to Brian. Her colleagues were scattered throughout the room, chatting in groups or posing for photos near a large company logo. Sarah was soon swept into a circle of coworkers offering hugs and congratulations. Sarah Lawson, the newest senior account manager in the building. "Nicely done," one said with a grin. Blushing with pride, Sarah replied, "Thanks, Dawn. Couldn't have done it without the team." Brian lingered beside her, exchanging polite nods as Sarah introduced him to her colleagues. He couldn't help but feel proud of her accomplishments, though his discomfort in the lively crowd grew. Clutching his drink, he forced small talk and occasionally scanned the room for an escape. Meanwhile, Sarah seemed in her element, joking, laughing, and radiating confidence. As the night progressed, the open bar drew many attendees, including Sarah, who joined in the celebratory drinks. Brian kept an eye on her from a distance, assuring himself that everything was fine. At one point, Sarah, holding a margarita, grabbed Brian's hand. "Come dance with me." "Dancing isn't really my thing," he replied, smiling awkwardly. "Come on, live a little," she teased, dragging him to the dance floor. For a few minutes, they swayed and laughed, and Brian felt his guard drop. Then, a coworker interrupted, tapping Sarah on the shoulder. "Sarah, sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Bentley wants to congratulate you in person. He's by the bar." Her eyes lit up.
"Sure."
"Brian, do you mind? I'll just say hello and come right back." "Go ahead," Brian replied, stepping aside. "I'll grab another drink." 15 minutes passed, and Sarah hadn't returned. Puzzled, Brian began searching for her. He checked near the bar, the buffet table, and the dance floor, but there was no sign of her. Approaching a pair of employees he recognized, he asked, "Sorry to bother you, but have you seen Sarah Lawson around?" One of them replied, "Not for a while. Maybe she stepped outside for some air." Brian ventured to the lobby, but it was empty. Just then, a woman named Heidi noticed him looking around. Smirking, she asked, "Looking for your wife?"
"Yes."
"Do you know where she went?" he asked. Raising an eyebrow, Heidi replied, "I believe she's with someone in one of the private rooms. Third door down that hallway." Her tone carried a knowing edge that unsettled him. Brian's stomach twisted. "Them?" he asked, but Heidi simply shrugged and turned away. His heart pounding, Brian walked down the hallway. Outside the third door, he paused, hearing muffled voices. Pressing his ear to the door, he recognized Sarah's voice, hushed and tense. "Are you insane? My husband is here."
"This is so risky," she said.
A man's voice chuckled. "As if that's ever stopped us before." Brian's blood ran cold. Without hesitation, he shoved the door open, the cheap lock giving way. Inside, Sarah stood by a small table littered with empty glasses, facing a tall man in a navy suit. She gasped at the sight of Brian, and the man turned around, startled. Brian's voice shook with rage as he demanded, "What the hell is going on here?" The man stammered, trying to explain, but Brian was past reasoning. He lunged, his fist colliding with the man's jaw, sending him staggering backward and toppling a bar stool. Sarah screamed, "Brian, stop," but he was in no mood to listen. He grabbed the man by his tie, dragging him through the door and into the corridor. It was empty at first, but soon, bystanders began peeking around the corners, their eyes wide. The man groaned, clutching his jaw. "Sarah, help." Brian snarled, "Help yourself, you scumbag." He hauled the man to the building's side entrance as Sarah trailed behind, pleading. Brian shoved the door open, letting in a gust of icy air, and without hesitation, threw the man outside into the sub-freezing darkness. The man stumbled onto the sidewalk, nearly slipping on a patch of snow. Brian followed and shoved him again. "You're crazy, man," the man cried, clutching his jaw. Brian's voice was raw with fury. "Crazy? Did you think I'd just stand there and watch you sneaking off with my wife?" He struck him again across the face, and the man crumpled to the ground. Partygoers filtered outside, shivering in the bitter cold, but hesitant to intervene. Many smirked or whispered among themselves, as if they'd expected this to happen. Sarah rushed out, hugging her coat around her body. "Brian, stop it. You're hurting him," she cried, kneeling beside the man, torn between concern and panic. Brian's voice was thick with betrayal. "You should have thought of that before sneaking around with him in front of everyone. You're humiliating me." He turned and noticed the crowd, some snickering, others sipping their drinks with mild curiosity. Heidi, the co-worker who had clued him in, leaned against a railing, arms folded, an amused twist on her lips. "Well, I guess you found them," Heidi said dryly. The realization hit Brian like a blow. The expressions on their faces made it clear they weren't shocked, just entertained. An uncomfortable hush settled over the parking lot. Eventually, a manager or security guard stepped in, separating Brian from the dazed man on the ground. Sarah begged him to calm down. The man said nothing, pressing a hand against his bleeding lip. Livid and humiliated, Brian spat on the pavement. "I'm done with this place." "Sarah, we're leaving now." She hesitated, looking torn. The bystanders parted as Brian stormed back inside to fetch his coat. Sarah followed him closely, tears streaming down her cheeks. The entire party had seen or heard the altercation. As they rode home in stunned silence, the weight of anger, heartbreak, and shame pressed on Brian. That night, after dropping Sarah off, he slept in the guest room. They barely spoke the next morning until the argument began. At first, it was subdued, but it quickly escalated into accusations and tears. "I want the truth," Brian demanded. Sarah sobbed, "I swear we never. That was just Michael, a colleague. He keeps flirting with me, pushing my boundaries. I told him no 100 times. Please believe me." "So you hid in a private room, telling him my husband is here, like you've done it before? You said, 'That's never stopped us before.' Was that just a random joke?" Brian shot back. Her cheeks burned red. He was just being cocky. I might have let him flirt, but I never crossed that line." "God, Brian, you have to trust me." Brian's voice trembled. "How can I trust you now? I saw the way your coworkers looked. They knew. They were smirking. You were sneaking off with that scumbag, and nobody was surprised. They argued for hours." Sarah pleaded innocence, claiming it was nothing more than drunken flirting, and that Michael was the aggressor. But the damage was done. Brian's mind reeled at the possibilities. Had she been seeing Michael behind his back? Even if she hadn't, Her secrecy and his insinuations revealed a deeper breach of trust. Finally, Brian spoke the words neither of them thought they'd hear. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah. I'm filing for divorce." Her eyes shone with tears, but he stood firm. That moment etched itself painfully into his memory. Within a week, Brian consulted a lawyer. Though no charges were pressed for the altercation at the party, the lawyer advised him to remain calm. Sarah tried everything: apologies, tearful confessions, even a vow to quit her job, but Brian was resolute. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. I can't unsee it," he said. Rumors spread around her workplace. Michael faced scrutiny too, though the firm largely turned a blind eye. Some co-workers gossiped about that infamous night in the freezing cold. At home, Ava and Logan, their children, sensed the tension but didn't fully understand. "Are you mad at Mommy?" Ava asked one afternoon. "It's complicated," Brian replied, forcing a smile. The divorce progressed rapidly. Sarah insisted she'd never physically cheated, but for Brian, the emotional betrayal was enough. They agreed on joint custody. Brian moved out, renting an apartment across town, while Sarah stayed in the family home temporarily. The heartbreak was immense, but the sense of betrayal loomed larger. By the time the final divorce decree was signed, months later, both were drained. In the lawyer's office, Sarah softly said, "I'm sorry," but Brian couldn't respond. He walked away, tucking the legal documents under his arm. That night, in his new apartment, he thought of his children, how holidays would be split, and how fleeting happiness had been. The memory of Sarah's laughter and the weight of betrayal intertwined. In the hush of the quiet apartment, Brian felt relief that the toxic confusion was over, but also a deep sadness for the family they once were. He stared out the window at the snow-covered streets, letting the finality of it all settle in.